What's up folks, Dr. D here with another audio production module 3. We're going to be doing bass and drums today. So we're going to cover how to set up microphones and mic placement on drum set, as well as recording the bass amp simultaneously and having the musicians play live in the same room. We're going to cover some of the stuff on the DAW side and routing through the studio using headphone mixes and DI boxes and all those good things. So let's do it. Okay, so the first step in every recording session is to plan everything out ahead of time. Get an idea of what inputs you're going to need, microphones you're going to use, what instruments you're going to mic, and equipment you're going to need before you start grabbing things and running around the studio to save time. Okay, so we're going to be recording a drum set and a bass guitar. The drum set's going to have a 3-piece. It's going to have floor tom, rack tom snare, and then your hi-hat and cymbals and everything else. So we put together an input list ahead of time. We're going to have a kick drum mic'd with 2 different mics on the front and the back. So the beater side to get some of the bright slap of the kick drum and emphasize the attack there. And then we're going to have the front of the drum head mic'd as well. So we're going to use a SM52A or Shure 52A. I think that's what it is. The kick drum mic, we're going to use an SM7B on the front of the head. For the snare drum, we're going to mic the snare drum from the top and the bottom because you can get kind of the nice sort of drum tone snare sound from the top, and then the bottom you're emphasizing the snare, like the sizzle and the hiss, those little wires that basically cause the snare to give it the snare sound. So now we are going to have 2 microphones facing in opposite directions, so phasing will be an issue, and you have a mic on the front and the back of a drum head, kick drum, and snare. So we're going to be using a phase switch on one of those mics to make sure that the polarity is matched up. We're going to do a room mic. I'm just going to put up a large diaphragm condenser a little bit further back in the room to get some of the room ambiance that we can mix in that later and bring in or take away some of those room sounds of the drum kit. We're going to have a bass direct in as well as a bass amp. We're going to have a talkback mic so that the engineer can communicate with the musicians, and we're going to have headphone mixers and headphone mixes routed out to these musicians. So it's really important for the band to be comfortable, and most bands are comfortable playing in the same room with each other. So when we're dealing with electric bass and drums and electric guitars, if you route using DI boxes and route signal through the walls and have amps in other isolated rooms, you can still get the nice raw loud guitar and bass tones while the musicians can all play in the same room together and maintain the isolation, having the drums isolated and nothing bleeding into those things, so we can overdub and do any kind of mixing, post-production stuff that might need to be done. Also, it's nice to do an equipment list of all the gear that you're going to need for the entire project. Another thing that we like to do once we're routing everything into the DAW, it's good to have which preamp and which interface number that these mics are going to go into in each of these patch bays. So this is kind of like a reference board that's really nice to have in your studio. When you're checking lines and running around trying to figure out which mic is which and what cable is not working and problem solving, you have this kind of reference point as a roadmap for everybody in the session to reference and figure out why things aren't working and hopefully make them work quickly. So first off, we'll start with the kick drum. Some kick drums have ports, meaning like a little hole in there in the front of the head, and in that case you can sometimes run a microphone all the way into the back of the drum head and get some beater sound there, or you can have a mic in the middle or on the outside. It really just depends on what it sounds like and what sound you're going for. Microphone choice as well, it's the same kind of deal. You're using microphones and the tones that those microphones have to capture what you're looking for, or to cut and reduce some of the sounds that you aren't looking for. We decided to go with the SM7B on the kick drum to see how that sounds. Another mic I might try is a ribbon mic. If you're going for really warm, hump on your kick drum hits, you can probably go with some different microphones. But anyway, we got the kick drum mic about 3 inches away, 2 inches away from the kick drum head. One thing to be wary of with the kick drums is they sometimes walk forward, so always be listening to your tracks and double checking after each take and make sure you're not hearing some weird staticky rubbing sounds from the kick drum walking into the front of the drum mic. We have the toms mic'd here with SM57s and kind of facing directly into the drum head and getting as close as we can with these near the edge. You always want to be weary of where the drumsticks are going to be flying. So as the drummer's playing, you want to have this microphone out of the direction of their sticks. The SM57s that we have on the snare drum, we got the top and the bottom there, and they're like an inch away from the drum head, kind of coming off the side. And you can play around with these. I mean, honestly, like there's no right and wrong way to do any of this. So if it sounds good, it's right. If it sounds super weird and it works with your style and your thing, there's nothing wrong with that either. We're using a small diaphragm Octava mic for the hi-hat. And if you notice, I've got the hi-hat mic kind of angled away from the drum kit. Microphones with their cardioid pattern most of the time pick up from the front of the mic the strongest, and around the sides and the back it starts to diminish. So I'm trying to keep bleed from the rest of the drum kit at a minimum. So I've got this hi-hat mic kind of angled away from the drum kit. This Beta 52A mic, which I'm using because a lot of times that beater's a little bright and slappy, and I'm going to try to get kind of a warmer punch to that kick. Overhead wise, there are two small diaphragm condensers as overheads, and what you're trying to do is capture in stereo the sound resonating off of the top of the drum kit. So if you look at, if you're doing a stereo pair like this, you can have them apart, on separate mic stands, and you're kind of shooting down at one half of the drum surface area and then another half of the drum surface area. So this one's capturing mostly like tom and hi-hat and crash, and this is kind of capturing a little bit of that stuff, but mainly focusing on this tom and these crash cymbals. Another thing you can do is get a mic clip mount that does a XY, and you can just have these two small diaphragm condensers on one mic split apart in stereo, and that sometimes helps with the phasing, because basically you have two microphones capturing the same instrument sound, and whenever you have two microphones on the same sound, you're going to have to check out phasing and listen for it or adjust for it in post. So something to be listening for as you sound check and see how these drums sound and fine tune things. So another tip about miking drums is you can use your ears. If you're trying to figure out where's the best place to place a mic on the snare drum or the kick drum or hi-hat or something like that, listen around, play the drum, move your ears around from corner to corner and listen for the differences in the tones. And if it's bright and you want it to be dark, use a microphone that accents the dark end of sounds. If you want something to be brighter that's too dark, use a microphone that's very bright sounding. So knowing your microphones and having kind of a lot of diversity in your mic cabinet, different mics that have different tones, bright and dark, basically EQ the drums without having to use EQ and post-production tools. Okay, cool. So next up we're going to run cables and use a snake and talk about cable placement and staying neat. Okay, so we've got our cables run. We are utilizing a cable snake, which we're routing into the patch bay that has 8 inputs, so that's inputs 1 through 8. That saves you some space on the floor with running mic cables. So I want to point out how these cables are all laid. The cables that correspond to each of the mics are kind of draped neatly over the mic stand. There's no twisting of the cable like around and around the stand. That makes it really hard to remove the cable if there's something wrong with it. The piles are nice and neat, over under wrapped, and then placed at the bottom of the foot of the stand. The reason we do this and try to be so neat about this is because as you're doing line checks and you realize, oh, this cable doesn't work or something's going on, you got to come back in here and physically follow the cable line, figure out if it's plugged into the wrong patch bay, if the cable's bad, if the mic's broken. As you're problem solving, it's really necessary to be able to cleanly be able to visualize which cable goes where and then remove it quickly and replace it with a new cable if you have to do that. Okay, so next up we're going to wire our bass in. We have a bass guitar, electric bass guitar. We're going to want to get a DI, a direct injection, or just a straight pickup signal from the bass. We're also going to want to get a bass amp sound as well, so we got 2 bass tracks. The way that we can do that and have the bass player stay in the studio room with the drummer is using a DI box. So this DI box has a 1/4 inch input as well as a 1/4 inch output, and then it has a low impedance XLR output as well. So the way this is going to work is you're going to plug the bass guitar into the input. This is a TS cable, just an instrument cable, so that's going to go into the input. Signal is going to travel in one direction into an XLR cable, so this DI box takes the signal down to a low impedance mic line or mic level, and then that's going to feed into the patch bay and then go into the interface in the other room. We also want to get the amp tone, so we have to pipe the signal through the patch bay into another room and into the bass guitar amp, and then we mic that amp and get that amp tone. So the way that we do that is we use the 1/4 inch instrument output, which is just splits the signal. One goes XLR, the other one goes out 1/4 inch, and we're going to route this into the patch bay so that we can route it into our bass amp in our isolated booth. Okay, so following the bass signal that was placed into the patch bay, number 4 in the studio room, we're going to find where the patch bay for studios, recording studio right here. We are going to come out of line 4, and we want to send that signal into this isolation booth, which is going to be right here, private instruction rooms. I believe it's 104, and that's going to send the signal out of that patch bay, and then we can run that into the amp. Okay, so coming out of the patch bay in the isolated room here, we're going to run the instrument cable out of the line and then run it into the bass amplifier. That way the signal travels all the way from the studio room, bass player in the same room with the drummer, and then we're going to mic the bass amp to get the amp tone and run that back into the patch bay and have that send into one of our interfaces and preamps in the control room. Next up, we got headphone routing. So we have 2 musicians. We're going to be tracking drums and bass, and we want to provide a custom mix for both of the musicians. So we're going to have 2 pairs of headphones that have a TRS 1/4 inch end with the adapter on it. We're going to have 2 TRS cables, which will be routed out of the patch bay wall into the headphone amps, and then we have the 2 headphone amps and the power plugs. So we plug these power sources in for the headphone amps. We've got power to our headphone amplifier. It helps boost the signal out of the wall. So each of these is going to be routed out of the patch bay wall with a TRS cable, which is sending 2 stereo signals left and right, and then a ground. So we'll patch that into patch 1. It goes into the drummer's headphone amp, goes into the input there, and then patch 2 is going to route into the bass player's headphone amp. And then the headphones will be plugged into one of the channels. These have a 4-channel output, so you could, if you had more musicians, you could just have a duplicate of the signal sent to 4 different headphones, and each person would have their own individual volume control. But they are going to be all mixing, basically all having the same headphone mix as far as instrumentation goes. So a lot of times this is way easier if everybody's happy with just keeping the same basic mix. You could just use one of these and have 3 or 4 people in the same room. But if you wanted to get fancy and you wanted to have separate headphone mixes for musicians, they're each going to need their own line coming out into these headphone amps. Okay, so in the control room with our headphone mixes, we're going to need to route headphone signal out of the DAW into the patch bay that corresponds with those line TRS outputs into the headphone amps. So on most interfaces, there's line outputs that are basically 2 monos, right, left and right. So we have these TRS splitters to stereo TS cables that we use in this situation. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in from out of the output 1 and 2 on the interface. This sums together into a stereo TRS here, and then we're going to route this into the corresponding patch bay on the studio side, which we had line 1 I think was going to be our drummer, and then line 2 was going to be our bass player. And then we're going to find the output 3 and 4, which will be the next stereo output. And then over here on the DAW side, to make that work, in Pro Tools we're going to use sends as a way of outputting the signal. And what I'll do is select all the instruments here, and I think it's Option Shift to create a output for line 1 and 2 across all of my instruments. And then I'll do the same thing for output of line 3 and 4 stereo. Okay, so basically what's going to go on, I can rename that track by right-clicking on it, and I'm going to come up with a new name for that output as drum mix. And then the second one, I'll right-click and rename that as the bass mix. Now what I can do at this point, once I've named the sends, which are outputs for the headphone mixes, is while holding down Command and clicking on the left side of that little nameplate for the sends, it exposes faders. And this is going to be how I create a custom headphone mix of the drum kit for the drummer and a custom mix of the instruments for the bass player that way. And then the outputs of that are sent through the outputs and into the headphone amp and then into the ears of those musicians, and they can get exactly what they want. Okay, now that we have all the instruments mic'd, all the drums mic'd and the bass and everything routed into the patch bays, now we need to connect the patch bay outputs in the control room to the appropriate interface preamps. So I usually start by going 1 through 8 with the female ends from the recording studio. And then out of the patch bay, the signal is going to travel into the interface. So I need to take note of which preamp I'm using as well as which interface I'm plugging into, so that I can make that correspond with the inputs on the DAW side of the session. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is check our routing and make sure that we have the right mic plugged into the right patch bay, plugged into the right interface, and that corresponds to the DAW side of things in the software. Okay, so first of all, we have our kick drum that should be set to the first input. Our kick front should be the second. So everything should follow suit with the way the inputs are set on the DAW, but we're going to arm all these, and I'm going to ask the drummer to tap the microphone one at a time and make sure that we have all of our lines coming through the proper inputs. Okay, so input 7, we have something going on with that input. So we might need to run in there, check our cable routing and make sure that the cable is plugged into the right channel, right interface, etc. Now, you just continue this process for all the mics, and then you're going to ask the drummer to play each of the drum instruments, and you're going to be checking the input level on the meter and adjusting the preamp volume to keep it from going above unity gain. So you want to keep your levels kind of somewhere in the ballpark of like -10 dB on these meters, and make sure that the same meter on the interface is still got some headroom, and then ask them to play as loud as they would possibly ever play. Okay, I'm going to ask the drummer to play each individual instrument, and I'm going to set the levels of the preamp here on the interfaces and try to find that sweet spot. Okay, let's hear the kick drum. A little hot on that second channel as well. Just give me long pops. Pop, pop. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is go and listen to each of these tracks now that I've got levels and the drummer's played. You notice I had to turn down the volume on a lot of the preamps because once you start playing the kit, you kind of get a little bit more excited and hit the drums a lot harder than usual. So you kind of have to tweak these things as things go and put ears on it and make sure all the tones are good. So we're going to solo each of the instruments and one at a time go through and make sure that we're liking our levels and our sound. Kick beater, kick front. Happy with that. Kick top or snare top. Okay, happy with that. There's our snare bottom. Okay, hi-hat. Okay, and then etc., etc. Once everything's happy, we can get the bass player checked and start tracking our song.